Good evening, good afternoon, hello, how are you? I hope this video finds you well. Well, folks, it has been something of a tumultuous week, I think. I think a lot of folks would say, without any shadow of a doubt, that this was an odd week. And when you say odd, riots, fucking crazy president, solidarity being shown across multiple cities about over policing. Shit went worldwide. Had some folks in Lebanon, had some folks in London, had some folks literally around the world showing solidarity with Americans and those who are oppressed by looking at policing. And I guess that kind of leads me to where I wanted to go tonight. I wanted to talk about policing. I wanted to have a conversation about what policing is, and in some ways, I wanted to have a conversation about where policing comes from. And policing, believe it or not, is not as universal as it may seem. A lot of people don't realize that policing, especially in the United States, is not and that has not always been. And I wanted to give a quick background on policing. I want to give you guys some background and understanding what policing is. See, here in the United States, policing did not exist up until about the 1600s. Well, the first official police watch, which is what they were known as, a night watch, and not that night watch, but a night watch, was around 1636. 1636 is where we first get our watches. And these are constables, mostly volunteered, and are, as my kids say, voluntold, because most watches were people who did not want to serve in the military, but were conscripted because they had to do something. Drunkards, folks who had a criminal background, and the watch was an overnight position. So this was the first set of quote-unquote cops. The first set of cops in the United States were essentially a voluntold army of people who would just sit around to watch and make sure nothing was broken, tampered with, and to warn if anyone was coming to do harm to a village or a hamlet. So that's the first order of law enforcement. And this persisted up until the 1830s. And in the 1830s, the first day watch was created, the very first one in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the home of modern day, not even modern day, is the home of policing. And if you remember what I just said, the first cops, the first ones, 1636. The first day cops, the first time we have law enforcement professionals, the day watch, 1833. It's almost 200 years of no cops. Just essentially a organization of people who just watched, and it was like an advanced neighborhood watch. So an advanced neighborhood watch is what you have. The advanced neighborhood watch is then expanded upon and professionalized in the 1830s in the United States. And this is well after the American Revolution. So during the American Revolution, there were no constables, there were no cops. It was essentially soldiers. And so in 1830s, we started seeing the professionalization of law enforcement. 1838, the city of Boston establishes the first true American police force. And in 1845, New York follows suit. So 1845, New York, and Chicago in 1851. All of these professional law enforcement institutions were not available during the Revolutionary War. All the pieces that we think of as things that are in the Constitution that prohibit law enforcement were really made for soldiers, not for peace or watch officers. They were made for soldiers who were there to keep the peace. And this persisted. This persisted up until now. Cops were not there to protect the people, but rather to protect capital, to protect businesses, to make sure that things weren't taken away and things didn't get destroyed. And this is important because understanding that police were there to protect capital is really where you want to start moving your conversation to. And really, if you're going to be honest, is very important for what happens now. Because all this does lead, these are all dominoes pieces. These are all pieces that link together and form the tapestry of the issue we're having now with over policing and militarization of police. So keep that in your bra, keep that in your head, that this is an issue with police officers in general, that they were never really made to protect persons, but capital. They were made to disrupt, to stop disturbances. Because remember, during this time frame, gangs prevalent, anti-immigration riots and mobs prevalent, anti-black, anti-Asian mobs prevalent. These were all things that would happen, and the cops would basically look a blind eye to, because as long as capital, as long as businesses weren't being disturbed, everything was fine. Now, note all these places I just listed were in the Northeast. You go a little down south, and all of a sudden, how policing operates changes. And the majority of modern policing, as we like to think of modern policing, has nothing to do with what we think. In the South, around, let's see here, around, I'm looking at my notes here. I got my notes on my bottom screen here, so I'm going to pop it in here. We start seeing the formation around 1704. We start seeing the Carolinas institute slave patrols. Again, not with the intention of protecting people, not in the business of helping others out. Slave patrols are in the business of monitoring and keeping track of slaves. That's their job. Monitoring and keeping slaves in check, finding lost property. Again, capital, capital, capital. And I want to keep saying that over and over again, because it's important to understand that these things are how modern policing happened. And to give you even more of understanding, this all leads back to where we are today. Because once you start realizing that the police have no intention of protecting people, but rather protecting property, we start to understand how it is that police brutality, once it's handed down, generation to generation, of property, and property, it becomes obvious that police departments have no interest in protecting people. And don't get me wrong, if you're in law enforcement, if you're one of the good ones out there, I love you. I hope you're doing great. But for the most part, we got to remember that not everyone is a good one. Not everyone was great and doing the good job here. And because of that, we have to remember why it is they weren't doing a good job. And I want to talk about how we got from the modern police forces of today and from the slave patrols and the night watches of the past. In order to have that conversation, you have to understand a piece of America's original sin, which is the Three-Fifths Compromise. Now, for those of you who are scholars, those of you who know some things about history, what is the Three-Fifths Compromise? Well, the Three-Fifths Compromise is essentially how the colonies decided they would handle the burden of slavery and population. Many of the southern states, which were principal to how the United States ran and made money through tobacco and cotton, depended on slaves to do the labor. But according to the Constitution, or the Constitutional Convention in 1787, what we had was a problem. Even though the population was comprised mostly of slaves and slave owners, according to the Constitution, citizens of our great country could only be landholding white men, of which the South did not have many. So this newly formed Congressional Congress, or this Congress they were forming, would be disproportionately Northeastern. And just as an FYI, 1787 is when this Constitution is being put together, and most southern states had abolished slavery altogether by 1804. So we're really looking at about a 13 of, let's round around a 20-year time period where the forming of the nation, the libertine ideas of all men are created equal, and most northern states are moving away from slavery. Matter of fact, some northern states had slavery at the signing of the Constitution, but most were moving away from it because it just wasn't good. It just didn't do them any good, because as people came into the country from other countries, as immigration happened, they had a full labor force, and they were able to use that labor force dynamically, whereas in the South, they did not have an oncoming amount of people who were capable of doing the labor and doing the work. So let's put these pieces together. The South makes a decision that they will leave the Union if the Union does not give them some level of compromise. And in the Federalist Papers 54, in the 54, or in the Federalist number 54, you got to do my number. In the 54th Federalist paper, Madison and more than likely Alexander Hamilton put forth an argument about how coming to the Three-Fifths Compromise was such a dilemma. It was so hard for him. Personally, I don't buy that shit at all. I'll just be honest with you. I don't buy into the idea of the Founding Fathers being so torn apart by the idea of how to create a state with slaves and freemen. Bullshit. I'm sorry. I'm just going to call it a spade here. I don't believe it. I don't believe they were racked over and over again with it. I think they just basically had to come to an agreement that would help one side stay in the Union a little bit longer. But neither here nor there. So the Three-Fifths Compromise is created. And the Three-Fifths Compromise says that for every man who is not freed, i.e. every slave, is 3/5 of a freed land-owning white man as far as the congressional numbers go. And the further this injustice, a bicameral Senate is created as well that gives every state 2 senators. Now, you may say, well, wait a minute. How is it anything got to do with policing? How's anything got to do with where we are now and the rioting and the killing and the whatnot and the hoo-hoo and the hey-hey? Here's where they start to converge. Southern states are given this concession to which they are allowed to continue to push for legislation that protects the institution of slavery and protects the enslavement of Africans and people of color. The Southern states are allowed to create a system of standing injustice against everyone who is not a white male. And it is tacitly agreed to by the northern landowners who needed who needed to be able to have the raw materials from the South to create and to maintain their businesses and their factories up north. The two needed each other in order to create a country that was able to sustain itself after leaving England. Now, this is important because if you understand what I just said, they needed an ability to create and maintain capital, which is why millions of Africans were told that they were lesser than their white counterparts and enslaved so that they could continue an economic system which would breed a certain level of lie and, let's just face it, a myth of servitude and inferiority. Because you very well can't treat a man as your equal if you've already written him as 3/5 of what you are. And you sure as hell can't have that person be equal to you in the law and then treat him like shit in the field. It doesn't work that way. So this compromise is made. The American people make a decision that it's okay to have this compromise. Southern states can continue to treat their chattel any way they want. Northern states will look a blind eye. And as these police departments are formed and created around the time of what would become the Southern Succession, all of a sudden, how Africans are treated, how people of color are treated within the United States is dictated almost entirely by where they land on the color line and where they land in states that respected, well, that's not true. I'm about to say respected people of color. They didn't. They didn't respect them at all, but were willing to compromise their principles and how they were treated as equals and to compromise those people in other ways. So these people of color, are pushed to the brink of mistreatment on both fronts. The Southern states, slave patrols are turned into sheriff offices. They are turned into police forces, which are then used to cripple the few freedoms that Africans and people of color had in the United States in the South. And the newly formed police forces in the Northeast are used to enforce the rules of factories and capitalists up north. Essentially, people of color and anyone not a successful land-owning white man were given the bottom end of the stick. And this is a built-in part of the system in order to keep southern states to be happy enough to join the union to begin with. This is America's golden sin. This is America's first drop of inequality. This is the original sin of the United States, is being able to look at someone and say, you're not a whole person, because if I make you a whole person, I have to treat you equally, and I want to make sure that we keep the capital that you're worth more than you as a person. So let's fast forward. A lot of this, as I'm talking about, is 1700s, 1800s. Let's move into the 1900s, where supposedly freedmen are equal in the eyes of the law. Supposedly. And I say supposedly because we all know it's not true. But police forces are still using the same rules as they used in slave patrols and in early watches in how they deal with race. And that is turn a blind eye to mistreatment and over-police any infraction to keep them in line. Over-policing and ignoring obvious injustices to keep the system going. Sound familiar? Of course it sounds familiar, because that's exactly what we've been doing for the last 200 years. So you fast forward a little bit longer, you get past the civil rights movement, and again, I'm moving pretty fast with all this information, so I'm trying not to bog you down. You fast forward a little bit, and all of a sudden you have a country that is still hung on these old principles of how to police the populace. And this country is, at least to some degree, starting to come to terms with how it got to where it is. Most Americans will agree that police mistreat African Americans and other people of color in a way they don't treat white America. Most people will happily agree to that. But the numbers support it too. Police are 20 times, not 20 times, police have a higher rate of arresting African Americans than whites for the same crime. African Americans are seen to have higher pain thresholds. And because of this, police officers tend to exude higher levels of force with people of color than with their white counterparts. Now you may say, okay, Zach, all these pieces are great points. Thank you for the wonderful history lesson. But how does this deal with where we are today? Well, to be honest with you, those bad habits, those ideas have stayed with us because the system that created them has not gone away. The system that created that level of injustice, the system that created that level of inequality, is still the same one that we honor and respect. We still look at the Constitution like some great document. We still say, well, there are amendments in here. Well, these amendments are great, except we work with the 13th, and all of a sudden you realize that essentially slavery was rewritten back in the Constitution under the guise of prisoners, under the guise of a prison system. And you have to remind people of this because in some ways it's really hard for people to understand that the 13th Amendment states neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. So these individuals who were once being used as capital and chattel can be put back into that chattel role as long as they're prisoners, as long as they are criminals, as long as there's some means by which they break the law, they are now reverted back to their original state according to how the state understands and deals with people of color. Thus the mistreatment and thus the inequality of the state as a violent actor towards people. So the state gets to act violently, the state gets to abuse, and the state does it without even knowing it because it still sees Africans as chattel. It still sees people of color as property. And when property is damaged, then the state, in most cases, will take action against that property. If property is damaged, the state will normally step in and stop it, except when it comes to black bodies, because black bodies and black people stop being property when they're free and start becoming a prisoner in waiting. Now, I saw the videos, you saw the videos. We don't need to rehash the atrocity. We don't need to play murder porn here, and I'm not going to show any clips. I'm not going to show any video. I'm good. Thank you so much. But when you look at what happened with Mr. Floyd, you have to wonder how far away we've gotten from our original intent. And like I said before, our original intent was never to protect people. The original policing principles of this country were soldiers. And if you look at a modern police officer, he has on a phone book size piece of body armor. He has on multiple gadgets and gizmos meant to protect him from the unruly. I mean, you ever stand next to a police officer and look at all the equipment they have? Batons, cuffs, gun, taser, possibly some mace. And you wonder, how scared a boy are you? How big a punk are you really? Because in all honesty, you carry that equipment around like Batman. And in most cases, all you're really doing is pulling people over and giving them tickets. But I digress. I'm sorry. That's a rant I'll save for the day. But modern policing has these built-in flaws because modern policing was never meant to do anything more than protect businesses. It wasn't meant to protect people. And when people are on the brunt of modern policing, there is a divide that most people, unless you know history, don't understand. There's a reason why if you're breaking into something, the police are there in an instant. If someone's giving you a hard time, it seems a minor problem. Disturbances aren't really an issue, but destruction is. And when you look at the riots, what you really are seeing are people destroying to bring attention to a problem that they couldn't do by just saying, we have an issue with their state. They couldn't just raise it in a quiet manner because no one will listen. That's a lot to put into a 30-minute show. It's a lot to put in a 30-minute segment, and I really hope that I was able to cover a good bit of it. Some of it, I know, some repeating there was going on, but I want to make sure we were all in agreement about what was happening and what is happening. The history of policing in this country is unique because, unlike other places, it was never intended or built upon the principle of protecting and serving. That's a good motto, and it's fun to put on police cars, and it's fun to tell kids that police are helpers. It's fun because, it makes them seem less scary. But the reality is most police officers are still running in their prior role, protectors of property and guardians of the enslaved. And that's really the truth. All right, folks, that's been Basically Complicated. Thank you for joining me. I hope to see you guys next week. I plan on putting out a formal video on Thursday that has edits and cool video jumps and parts. And I hope to see you guys around real soon. Take it easy. Be safe. Be well. See you guys tomorrow morning for a game of morning chess as we break down a couple of games that we will play in the morning. All right, you guys. Be safe. Be well. And we'll see you guys next time.